Approximately 8 centuries ago, in the harsh embrace of a dark and unforgiving Icelandic winter, one of the North's most captivating stories was immortalized on parchment. This tale, whispered by hearths and proclaimed at feasts for centuries, recounted ancient myths, terrifying monsters lurking in uncharted lands, and, of course, the valiant deeds of great heroes whose names resounded throughout the world. Now, thanks to a truly revolutionary literary tradition that blossomed on Iceland's icy shores, this epic saga received its final, immutable written form, destined for all future generations. Its echoes reverberated from Greenland's icy fjords to the sunny shores of the Mediterranean, permeating the vast Viking world until the 13th century. It was passed down by word of mouth, memorized, and retold by one generation of skalds and storytellers after another, becoming one of the most beloved and remarkably enduring narratives of its time. Even today, this legendary tale continues to live on, inspiring and enchanting. We are speaking of the famous saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. But behind all these heroic acts and mythical traditions lies an intriguing question. How much truth do these ancient lines contain? Prepare to delve into the depths of history to uncover this mystery. In 814 AD, the mighty monarch Charlemagne, ruler of Western Europe's most extensive empire since the fall of the Roman state, passed away. After his demise, the once unified and prosperous state rapidly plunged into a maelstrom of internecine warfare among his descendants. While some other peoples who filled the vacuum left by the Romans, such as the Visigoths in Spain or the Ostrogoths in Italy, adopted the Roman tradition of inheritance by a single son, the Franks chose a different path. They stubbornly adhered to their ancient, centuries-old tradition of dividing their domains among all sons. When the storm of succession struggle finally subsided, all of Charlemagne's grand endeavors proved futile, primarily due to the actions of his own descendants. 3 independent kingdoms emerged on the political map of Europe. Eastern Francia to the east, a state that would eventually become Germany. Lotharingia in the center, a kingdom destined to be absorbed by the other 2 powers. And in the west, in the ancestral lands of the Franks stretching along the Atlantic coast and deep into Gaul, Western Francia was formed, the kingdom that would become France. It was here, under the rule of Louis the Pious and his heir Charles the Bald, that a growing deficit of centralized power was increasingly exploited by a new, rising threat. For many years, the Franks had advanced into the pagan north, seeking to conquer new territories and convert more people to Christianity. Now, the time had come to pay for these long-ago campaigns. Initially, they arrived in small groups, just a few boats, merely testing their luck. However, as the years passed, increasingly powerful waves of piratical sea raiders surged from the relentless north. The Viking Age had begun. Frankish sources from that time mention Horik, king of the Danes, likely just one of many Danish rulers, whom the West Frankish king Louis the Pious undermined by supporting Horik's rival for the throne, Harald Clack, in a bid to overthrow him. While such a divide-and-conquer policy might have succeeded under the firm hand of Charlemagne, whose elite army would have easily dealt with piratical invaders from the north, military standards had significantly declined over the years, and the Frankish army was now but a pale shadow of its former glory. After Horik successfully repelled his rival's attacks, the full fury of the Norsemen was destined to fall catastrophically upon Louis. First in the form of small fleets, and then in the guise of a powerful and influential chieftain who would forge his way onto the historical stage in the following years. If the legends and traditions that later narrated his life are even remotely true, he was one of the earliest examples of a sea king in the Viking Age, and certainly one of the most memorable. Ragnar Lothbrok had arrived. Since the end of the Saxon Wars in the late 8th century, Scandinavian raids had become a common occurrence for Francia. These wars represented a long and arduous conflict against the inhabitants of ancient Saxony, still a pagan land located directly south of Denmark, and concluded with the forced conversion to Christianity or death for many of its inhabitants. It was after this 30-year evangelistic crusade that the Franks first came into direct contact with the inhabitants of Denmark, though the Franks' reputation almost certainly preceded them. While the emperor was alive, Europe remained largely safe. According to Charlemagne's biographer Einhard, writing just a few years later, "The only places plundered and devastated during his lifetime were a few islands off the coast of Frisia, near the German shores." The emperor even established coastal guard squadrons to protect river systems. After his death, all of this was set to change. Without a strong and powerful ruler to lead it, Charlemagne's empire quickly disintegrated, and within just a few years, the Danes swarmed like vultures to pick at its carcass. Detachments consisting of 30 to 40 ships filled with opportunists became commonplace throughout the 810s and 820s. And they achieved significant success, raiding remote and sparsely populated areas on the periphery of the West Frankish coast. However, by the 830s, these fleets began to comprise dozens of vessels, and as rumors of their successes spread, they increasingly tested their luck against larger targets. They plundered the silver minting center of Dorstad in 834, 835, and 836, and devastated the trading town of Alcarin in 837. At first glance, King Horik seemed to disapprove of these raids, which he publicly condemned in letters to Charlemagne's successor, Louis the Pious. While this could very well have been a ruse, such behavior still suggests that King Horik, in reality, possessed little authority over Denmark's increasingly rebellious and ambitious chieftains. In 845, a completely new type of army arrived on the continent. Not just dozens of ships, but a fleet of hundreds, packed with up to 5,000 Viking warriors. Where this fleet came from remains a matter of speculation, but according to Frankish sources, it was led by a man named Ragnar, whom a number of modern scholars link to the most famous Viking of all time, Ragnar Lothbrok. A number of sagas tell of Ragnar's early life, but the vast majority of them are likely later additions, made as his legends and deeds inflated over time, especially as a large number of later chieftains claimed descent from him and wished to inflate their own egos, just as he himself apparently claimed to be a direct descendant of Odin, as did most Danish kings and chieftains of that era, including his overlord Horik. From 12th century runic inscriptions in the Orkney Islands to 13th century Icelandic sagas, Ragnar became nothing short of a celebrity in the centuries following his death. In truth, if anything of his extraordinarily colorful nature described in the sagas has any basis in reality, Ragnar himself would probably have been quite amused by these later stories that arose around him. Nevertheless, whether he wore magical hairy pants or not, the Ragnar who landed on the Frankish coast in 845 commanded a huge army of warriors, over 5,000 Vikings, if Frankish sources are to be believed, all housed on approximately 120 longships. Whether they were sent directly by Horik or not, the Danish king was about to exact his impressive revenge against the Franks. Undoubtedly one of the most colorful members of Horik's court, Ragnar's nickname is said to have originated from the cowhide trousers he wore into battle, which, if the stories are to be believed, he claimed granted him magical protection from enemies. According to Old Norse sagas, which are at best quasi-historical and often pure myth, especially in this early period, he made these magical pants by boiling cowhide in tar, and subsequently used them to win his second wife Aslog by defeating a serpent that guarded her. Because he was one of the earliest sea kings to devastate Europe, if Ragnar Lothbrok was indeed a real historical figure, and scholars still actively debate this question, his genuine historical achievements became obscured over time. For centuries, stories were told to fill in the gaps of his life, and authentic events were so embellished that his narrative largely transformed into fantasy. Nevertheless, if he truly was a real historical figure, and several Frankish sources seem to imply this, Ragnar was no mere pirate, like those who came before him. He was one of the earliest examples of a sea king, a maritime ruler powerful enough in his own right to conduct his own autonomous attacks and seize land for himself and his followers on foreign shores. Ragnar, or Ragnar, was likely active in Francia from the 830s, and by 841, King Charles the Bald had granted him lands in Frisia, probably as a bulwark against other Viking raiders. However, within a few years, he lost these lands, as well as the king's favor. In 845, he entered the River Seine at the head of a massive force, the largest ever to descend upon Francia, at a time when armies typically numbered in the hundreds. According to Frankish sources, Ragnar's forces numbered 5,000 men. They plundered Rouen and carried off a vast amount of wealth before moving further south to the capital, where they systematically ravaged the fertile areas around Paris. Like his predecessors and his descendants after him, Ragnar fought only when the odds were in his favor, preferring blitzkrieg tactics to terrorize, demoralize, and crush opponents before they could gather forces strong enough to oppose him. Determined to prevent the invaders from plundering the royal abbey of St. Denis, Charles divided his army into two parts, positioning one on either side of the river. A shrewd tactician, Ragnar simply attacked the smaller army, annihilating it before the helpless eyes of their comrades on the other bank. The Frankish warriors could only watch as just over 100 survivors were sacrificed to Odin on a small island in the River Seine. Faced with insurmountable odds, the terrified defenders of the city could only await the inevitable Viking attack. At that time, Paris was located on an island in the River Seine. It was fortified with strong defenses, but being isolated, it was ideally suited for a Viking blockade and attack. On March 29th, Easter Sunday, almost certainly a date deliberately chosen to demoralize the already frightened locals, Ragnar's men arrived and plundered the outskirts of the city. However, sickness soon began to rage in Ragnar's camp, significantly weakening his position. Eventually, terms were offered, and Charles reluctantly agreed to pay approximately 6,000 pounds of gold and silver for Ragnar and his men to leave. This was the very first of at least 13 Danegeld payments made over the next century to persuade Vikings to peacefully depart Francia. Although Charles was heavily criticized for this payment, he had more pressing concerns: his brothers, discontented nobles, and regional rebellions, all threatening his position at any moment. He chose instead to try and get the Vikings, who were perhaps the least of his worries at the time, to leave peacefully if at all possible. Ragnar agreed to depart Paris, though he appears to have plundered several locations along the coast on his way home, presumably to Denmark. Upon his arrival, he is said to have displayed the acquired riches to King Horik and boasted of how easy the attack had been, though he also recounted that the only resistance they faced was from the long-dead Saint Germain of Paris, whom he believed had sent the plague that ravaged his camp. However, shortly after Ragnar's return, the king of eastern Francia, Louis the German, apparently imposed his suzerainty over the Danes, likely only some southern ones, which prompted Horik to execute many of the men responsible for the Paris raid and confiscate their plunder to return to the Franks. Along with numerous other reasons, namely economic and social, this tightening of measures against raiders may have been one of the reasons why so many Scandinavians left Denmark at this point to arrive in other Viking settlements across the North Sea, such as Ireland and the Scottish Isles. Meanwhile, Ragnar had apparently already left these parts, embarking on a piratical career that is impossible to separate from the mists of legend. Perhaps he raided in the Irish Sea, returned to Francia, or, most famously, he may have raided Northumbria, though the king he supposedly fought, Aella, would not become king there until the mid-860s. In 854, Horik was killed by one of his nephews, and the exiles involved in the Paris raid were apparently allowed to return home, though Reginher or Ragnar is never mentioned again in Frankish sources. Stories of his ultimate demise abound. Some say he was killed during a failed attack on the Isle of Anglesey. Others, that he perished in a civil war between Danes and Norwegians off the coast of Ireland. However, the most famous of all is the story that he was shipwrecked off the English coast during a storm and captured by the Northumbrian king Aella, who, in a cruel punishment against the old sea king, threw him into a pit of snakes. According to one retelling of this story, his famous trousers protected him until the very end, and the disgruntled English king had to pull his enemy from the pit to remove them before throwing him back in. The Vikings returned to Paris again in the 880s, this time led by another of history's most famous Vikings, a sea king named Rollo, who was not, in fact, related to Ragnar. In one of the great turning points in French history, and arguably one of the largest sieges of the Viking Age, a massive force of many hundreds of ships was finally repelled in 886. By this time, much of Britain had already fallen under Viking rule, this time, according to legends, led by brothers who, in a number of traditions, called themselves the sons of Ragnar. According to this saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, recorded sometime in the 13th century but recounted in mead halls from Dublin to Kiev centuries earlier. Ragnar had several sons, all legendary sea kings in their own right. According to the saga, while dying in Aella's snake pit, Ragnar famously alluded to his sons, how the little pigs would grunt if they knew what the old boar suffers. These sons of Ragnar were indeed prominent figures. Ivar the Boneless, possibly king of Dublin for a time and progenitor of the famous Uí dynasty, which would terrorize the Irish Sea for many centuries. Bjorn Ironside, a raider of the Mediterranean who was later said to have retired to Sweden. Ubba, Duke of the Frisians and participant in the 860s invasion of Britain. Halfdan Ragnarsson, one of the first kings of Viking-occupied Northumbria, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, born of a sorceress. All of them are celebrated warriors in their own right, though, in all likelihood, they were not actually descendants of Ragnar. In the sagas, upon learning of their father's death, Ivar and Ubba swore to cross the sea to avenge him. Halfdan was playing chess, and when he was informed of the news, he gripped a piece so tightly that blood oozed from under his fingernails. The coming invasion is known to us today as the Great Heathen Army. Forged in the Scottish Isles in the 12th century, it embodies the legend Ragnar became, capturing his final words, sung aloud while the snakes of Aella's pit coiled around him. It gladdens me that Baldur's father prepares the benches for a feast. Soon we shall be drinking ale from curved horns. The warrior who enters Odin's dwelling, Valhalla, does not lament his death. I shall not enter his hall with words of fear on my lips. The Aesir will welcome me. Death comes without regrets. I am eager to depart. The Dazur call me home. Those whom Odin sends for me. The Valkyries from the halls of the Lord of Hosts. I shall joyfully drink ale on the high throne with the Aesir. The days of my life are numbered. I laugh as I